Hey, garden nerds, we have a sponsor for this episode. True Leaf Market has been a supplier of exclusively non-GMO seeds since 1974. They offer a wide selection of seeds, many of which are heirloom and organic, for everything from vegetables to flowers, grains to herbs, and specialty seeds. And when I say specialty seeds, I'm referring to their huge selection of seeds and growing supplies for sprouting and microgreens. So check that out. Their seed packets are affordable and are available in sizes for the home gardener all the way up to bulk wholesale. Visit trueleafmarket.com and use our promo code GTOTW50, that's for Garden Nerd Tip of the Week, 50, and check it out. Now, on with the show. Welcome, everyone, to the Garden Nerd Tip of the Week podcast, where garden nerds from around the world talk shop, share stories, and offer their favorite tip. I'm your host, Christy Wilhelmi. My guest this week is Helen Atthowe. She is a celebrated pioneer in eco-organic methods and owner of Woodleaf Farm, which has moved to its third location in Western Montana. More about that in a minute. Her decades of farming experience and research with her late husband helped her develop techniques to reduce and eventually eliminate fertilizer inputs. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. These methods are documented in her new book, The Ecological Farm. Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you. What a pleasure to be hanging out with nerds.
You're in good company. This is exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because I'm about 60 pages into your book. And the first part is dense because it dives into the science behind this research that you've done and how your soil and nutrient content changed over the years and while you were experimenting with things. So, but before we get into that, which is very exciting to me, and I can't wait to talk about it, can you give us a little bit of an overview of Woodleaf Farm? I know it has moved recently, but what's the history of that a little bit?
Yes, actually, Woodleaf Farm was the name of my husband's farm in California, and I moved there and we ran Woodleaf Farm together. He started his Woodleaf Farm in California, Northern California, in 1982, and it was certified for 35 years. And then we did very well, and we decided that we would retire or semi-retire to 200 acres in Eastern Oregon.
200 acres.
200 acres, yes. We were ambitious and busy. And then when it was me by myself, I ran the place for a few years, and I just literally this spring moved back to where I grew up in Western Montana, and I have the smallest farm that I've ever had, which is 5 acres, and I am in zone 5. We were in zone 5A. It's more 5B here in Montana. We were in zone 5 in Eastern Oregon and zone 7 in Northern California. And like you, I believe, we are in an arid, all of the Woodleaf farms have been relatively arid with a low rainfall, or what used to be low rainfall until the strange weather that we've been having the last couple of years.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
I'm in Montana, but I do need to tell you that before I met and married and moved to Northern California, I was farming here in Montana, and that's where I did a lot of the research in the first part of the book.
Oh, okay. So, and then you carried it on in different soil in Oregon, right?
In Oregon and in Northern California. So I've been lucky enough to try these methods in 4 or 5 different soil types and different climates, which boy, I learn every time. Just before we started this, I was telling you I'm learning all these new things from this new farm.
It's exciting and scary, isn't it?
Yes, it is scary, but we need to be brave.
Right. Well, this leads me to my next question, which is, because you're an educator and you teach these methods based on your research from the past 30 years, it's this learning curve that you are on, as well as what you're teaching. So how did you find this work, or did it find you?
Yes, that's a great question. I think that I was always going to be a gardener. I didn't know I was going to study plant science and be a farmer. That came a little later on, or at least partway through my undergraduate work, and then I went to graduate school. But actually, what really happened is that I took some time off during undergraduate and traveled, and I realized I met some amazing farmers and ecologists, and realized that that was what I wanted to do. I got to work with Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote The One Straw Revolution.
Really?
That's where living mulches started. And then
Yeah.
it took me about 40 years to figure out how to do it properly.
Yeah, I read that book and I thought, how the heck do you get this right without a mentor or real solid guidance? You can't just try.
I'm so glad you said that, because the first part of this book, The Ecological Farm, is a little nerdy. I'm just going to have to say that I am indeed a nerd. I love this stuff, but it is dense. But that's because working with nature and doing the things that Masanobu Fukuoka talked about, it takes a lot of understanding, because it's complex to work with ecological relationships rather than just managing crops alone.
Yeah. I find that it's a big chain reaction that happens when you change one thing, other stuff shifts. And I'm going to ask more specific questions about that specifically in a minute. But first, the subtitle of your book, The Ecological Farm, is A Minimalist, No-Till, No-Spray, Selective Weeding, Grow Your Own Fertilizer System for Organic Agriculture. And I'm not even sure where to start, which part of that to start, but you open the book with 10 principles that you use to guide your farming. And most of them focus on managing healthy soil and, feeding the soil rather than, or feeding the soil microbes, microbial life, rather than feeding the plants themselves. Can you give us an overview of the foundation of these 10 principles?
Yes, and I really like what you said about managing chain reactions, because I think that's what our 10 principles are about, that there are a multitude actually of overlapping ecological principles when you try to farm or garden with nature. And and realizing that there are cascading effects is part of it. So yes, starting with minimal disturbance to the soil. And the principles, the first 4 or 5 principles, are related to growing your own fertilizer, growing your own carbon, disturbing the soil as little as possible, maintaining living roots in the ground. That may be the most important principle, I think. And if you just try to figure out all the techniques involved with maintaining living roots in the ground, you realize a lot of these 10 principles and how they multitask. So some of the later principles are maintaining habitat where your crops are. And that means, going back to some of the soil principles, maintaining above and below ground plant diversity as much as possible throughout your farm and garden. So that's kind of a quick overview of the principles.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to this diversity, the plant diversity, in a minute, because I have questions about this. But I want to talk about, partly this chain reaction has happened negatively for me in that I have firsthand experience with over fertilization and the binding up of nutrients. It's this chain reaction that happens when the soil food web is out of balance. And for me, it kind of happened when there was compaction and overwatering happening at the same time. It killed off the good bugs, the good microbes, and invited in space for the bad microbes, and you end up, that's where nematodes come in, they sort of, the bad nematodes come in, and then zinc happened to get excessive, like it became really excessive in the soil and was binding up all the nutrients, and suddenly nothing would grow. And I find that happens every once in a while in people's gardens, my client gardens. You write about this in the book. How did you discover this in your own experience, and how did you solve? I know this is a huge question because it's very varied. The reactions differ depending on what's going on, but how did you deal with this problem, and what brought you to an understanding what's actually happening at the time?
Oh, that is such a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. And that is really how I started moving in the direction of more ecological farming. My farm in Montana in the 80s and 90s, well, actually, excuse me, in the 90s and the 2000s was pretty ecologically oriented already. People thought that I was on the path for sure. I tried to minimize tillage by having living mulches. They were annual living mulches. So I tilled the field every spring, and then I would plant legume living mulches in between the crop rows. And I would periodically mow them so that it didn't get weedy. That was my only reason to mow at that time. And leave in place. And so I was leaving all of this crop residue, all of this, it was mainly clover at this point, white clovers, and then later red clovers. And I would leave the stuff on the surface, but I didn't count it as fertilizer because in college and graduate school, we knew that residues left on the surface lose a lot of nitrogen to the atmosphere, and we weren't getting a lot of nutrient out of that. Well, I did soil tests every year, and throughout the 90s and early 2000s, I also did experiments, and so did multiple soil tests, and I realized, oh my goodness, I was getting excessive nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and particularly excessive nitrogen. And I could see it in my soil tests, and I began to see blossom end rot in my main crop. I was a big tomato grower. And so I diminished the compost that I was adding. And then I finally stopped using any compost. The blossom end rot went away, and I got better levels of nitrogen. And I realized that my yields didn't go down even with much lower levels of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium than I had ever believed possible. And then I met my husband, and he said, well, yeah, of course. And from there, we went on and just went crazy with the low levels of soil nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but particularly nitrogen, that we were able to maintain in our soil and still have excellent yield and quality. So it took me a while to stop being a nitrogen hoarder.
So can you walk us through, because you describe it and there are pictures in the book of how you're situating these living mulches that you're growing, and where these plant residues or the biomass that you're cutting down or mowing is ending up. Can you give us a kind of visual image of what that looks like?
Yes, and remember that this was an evolutionary process, that I developed the system I'm going to describe right now over about a 15 to 20 year period. So remember to be cautious and start out slowly. And remember that I started with annuals, or well, they were perennials, but I treated them as an annual.
You were tilling them in with the roots. You weren't leaving the roots undisturbed, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. In the early 90s, I was tilling the whole field.
Okay.
And then replanting. And then in the 2000s, I said, oh, maybe I could be braver. And I started I planted this beautiful field, 6 acres of red clover, and it came so beautifully with no weeds. I said, aha, let's just strip till, meaning that you only till where your crop is going to be. So where your beds are. So I only tilled, and now this is how I do it. I only till shallowly, actually, the bed. So about, depending on the crop, about 3 to 4 foot wide. And then I leave about 4 foot wide untilled perennial living mulches.
And then you mow those occasionally, right?
Right. So when I first started doing this in the 2000s, and I had that beautiful field of red clover, I mowed the red clover and I would then blow it into my vegetable crops.
So they're basically you're blowing all the biomass onto the plant soil that where the crops are growing.
Right, but I do that again very carefully and and selectively. The word that I like to use is selectively, because on seeded crops, obviously, well, I learned it the hard way, but I'll tell you, obviously, you don't want to blow a bunch of mulch, even if it's high nitrogen legume mulch, onto your corn seedlings coming up, or in the case that I had a problem with my dry bean rows, because you will mulch them into oblivion.
You smother them. Yeah.
But isn't that good news? Because if you say, I could probably use this for newly germinating annual weeds, right?
Yeah.
So that my living mulch can multitask, and that's how I do it now selectively. I will use that living mulch for nutrient cycling, for habitat for spiders and carabid beetles and beneficial insects, and to suppress annual weed seedlings starting to germinate. But timing is key, and so I'll mow selectively and blow it into the crop rows, depending on whether they're transplants or seedlings. And the other thing that is really important to me that I could spend the next hour talking about is the timing of the quality of the residue, and trying to balance the carbon to nitrogen ratios. So for gardeners, I'm just going to say it simply, that green and succulent, low carbon, high nitrogen. Browner and more dry, higher carbon, lower nitrogen. And what I found in my research over the years is that what my soil microbes want is a balance of all of that. They don't want just what I call the Snicker bar diet of legumes and sugary, green, succulent, low carbon, high nitrogen materials. They really want both for a diversity of your microbial community or your soil food web. So all of that is to say that I'll start out in the spring, and I will have my perennial living mulch starting to green up. And where I mowed in the fall, I mowed a lot of kind of drier and browner residue onto the beds to cover them for the winter. And some of that living mulch from the previous year had started to slowly move into the beds, right? But I can use that, right? I want a living root all the time. So some of the living mulch that's moving into my beds will then be the wintering area. It'll be something that I can lightly strip till in the spring. So I'm starting in the spring. Everything's warming up, and I will lightly till my bed, and the residue from the following year is incorporated to feed my soil microorganisms. And any of the roots from the invading living mulch or the gently moving into my bed living mulch.
That's a good way of thinking about it. Yep.
That is filled in. So I don't have to plant cover crops, do I? Because that the roots are moving in. And then I let that sit, as all good gardeners do. We let that sit for a week or two. And then that nice green succulent living mulch that's just starting to grow in between my crop rows, I will mow some of that, but not all of it. I'm leaving some as habitat for beneficial insects, and my early beds, I mow and blow that into the bed. And then I had this nice green stuff on top of all of that other residue that was a little higher carbon that I had incorporated 2 weeks earlier. And then I till that in a second time, because my one of my rules for tillage is that the only time I till is when I'm tilling something in to feed my soil microbial community. So I give them that nice green fresh stuff and I till it in again, and then I'm ready normally to seed or transplant. Sometimes I will mow a third time and till a third time for really a fine seed bed, things like carrots and arugula, something that really wants is kind of a baby.
Right, that needs a clean bed.
Exactly. But you see that how I'm doing this, and then I haven't even added what I do in terms of weed suppression. Those two tillages, I allow things to dry out in between, then I will seed or plant my transplants, and then I let things grow, and I let the weeds that may germinate do that, and I go through and I scuffle hoe, or I have a wheel hoe that I just go right over the surface. I disturb those weeds, and again I let them dry out a little bit, and then I come through, and by then the living mulch has grown 6 to 8 inches, and I mow it and blow it in between my crop that is now big enough to have a mulch, and I'm multitasking as weed suppression and habitat for beneficials, and I'm starting that slow nutrient cycling process. So I know that sounds terribly complex, but you did ask the nerdy question.
I did. And I just want to say for listeners who are like, well, this doesn't apply to me because I have raised beds. We're going to get to a question about that in a minute. But I just want to say that through this process that you've come up with and the research that you've done, you've gotten to the point where you don't use any fertilizer and or compost, or you're not applying, your inputs are pretty much zero outside of your living mulches. Is that correct?
Well, I'm gonna say generally yes. So in the orchard that we started in 2016 in Eastern Oregon, we did no till. So we mowed and blew the residue into where the trees were going to grow, and then we took hay mulch from another part of the field, and we applied it where each hole was going to be, each tree hole, about a half a bale of hay per hole, about 50 pounds of hay mulch. So after we applied the 50 pounds of hay to each tree hole to basically mulch where we were going to plant the tree, we also made a mix of micronutrients, manganese and iron and zinc, and based on our soil tests, and a little bit of rock phosphate, and some potassium, and um, and that was the only fertilizer the orchard got, and no nitrogen fertilizer at all. And then we planted the trees the next spring, and that would have been, they were planted in 2016. And this spring, they were leafing out and doing beautifully and producing exactly. So no off-farm fertilizer except that mineral mix in the beginning. Yeah, for 7 years.
Amazing. That's
And then
incredible.
for the vegetables, um, we do something somewhat similar, and what I described earlier to you with the living mulch and the reduced tillage. strip tillage only in the crop row. So every year we're mowing different kinds of carbon to nitrogen, well, the same residue, but different quality of residue, different carbon to nitrogen ratio residue throughout the season. So the trick is we're adding residue regularly rather than all at once, as I used to in the spring when I added all that compost. And my soil microbes, poor things, felt like we do after a big, huge Thanksgiving dinner where all you want to do is sit on the sofa and rest.
All the cakes and cookies, and then nothing after that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So I find this very fascinating because there's been this, I want to call it a myth, that if you put undecomposed biomass down in your soil, it steals nitrogen away from the plants and they suffer, which to a degree there is a drop in nitrogen or nutrients at first because the microbes are consuming it, but then they give it back, right?
Exactly. And that's why it's really key to do a little bit regularly throughout the season rather than a whole bunch of mulch. And because there is definitely, it's a myth that you can't have that as a fertility system, but it's not a myth that the microbes use it first. And then they will release it to the soil. And actually, I talk about that in unfortunately nerdy detail in the book. And there are some experiments that we did to show about how long it will take for that residue to break down. But the residue that I am applying in the spring is not to feed my crop that spring. It's to feed my crop in August. Mm-hmm. So if you think of it that way and think about feeding the microbes and a little at a time and using with the vegetables some tillage. Because the tillage and then the other thing that speeds decomposition, all the good things that speed decomposition, because you want rapid decomposition. If you don't have rapid decomposition in your soil, if you don't have a healthy microbial community, this is not going to work until you build up a healthy microbial community. But you need good oxygen, so you can't have that compacted soil you were talking about.
Right.
You need good temperatures. Your soil microbes want it to be at least 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit before they're going to be active. Otherwise, they just strike and won't work.
They strike.
Yeah. And you want residues of differing quality of nutrients and of different carbon to nitrogen ratios. And most importantly, you want water. Where I have tried to do this in drought conditions, I have not had as good success.
Yeah, it's hard with drought. But the biomass that you're piling on top also kind of helps keep moisture in the soil if, to some degree, if it's thick enough, right?
It certainly does. And the other thing that's happening over time is that biomass is increasing your soil organic matter and decreasing the amount of water that you will actually need. So your soil holds on to water. So yes, it will help your whole system be more resilient to several things. High heat, high rainfall. You may know something about that now.
Yep. We had our hurricane that came through in August. Yes.
Right. And a little and drought as well. So this system does help you to be resilient, but I do know that for these residues to decompose, you need all of the things I just mentioned, including irrigation or water.
Yeah. Just throwing this out there as an example for the small space gardeners listening, one of the things that I've done every year is I plan ahead to where my tomatoes are going to be in the spring. And that winter, I will grow a leguminous kind of multi-diverse community of oats and hairy vetch and peas, field peas and fava beans. And I'll grow it in that space. And then I cut down the roots I cut the biomass just below the soil. So I'm leaving the roots in place, and then I'm chopping up the biomass, laying it on that bed where my tomatoes are going to go in spring. And then I cover it with a layer of compost, which in my community garden is basically horse manure mixed with straw or bedding, and so it's mostly decomposed, but not quite. And I put that on top and water it. And basically you wait 3 weeks and then you're ready to plant the stuff. So that the biomass is there breaking down, and the tomatoes always seem to do gangbusters after that. And the nutrients are being released from the roots that are still in the soil. Do you do anything that's pretty detailed, but honestly, I'm only working in a 4x4 foot bed, so it's easy to do by hand. Are you, in talking about your living mulches, because I'm going to get to a question about clover, you explain the differences between a lot of different types of mulch. We've had guests on who've talked about the benefits of, say, ramial wood chips versus regular chipped wood or bark. What have you found are the benefits of living versus non-living mulches?
Oh, that's another good question. And again, I spent a whole bunch of time on this in my book because it's such an important question. And I think that you can do both. There's no reason not to have living mulches for that growing root or that living root, and to also bring in other kind of mulch material. It's all good residue. Again, pay attention to the amount that you add at any one time and the carbon to the nitrogen ratio. But generally, in the orchard, I'm just going to say, where you have perennial, big, competitive roots, we use what would be considered ramial wood. We prune the orchard, right? And then we mow the prunings right into the soil. So that's basically, right, ramial wood. So we add that, and then we add the mowed living mulch throughout the season as well. So I'm a believer in all of that. In a small garden space for annuals, I like your system. And if I didn't want to do compost, and I did used to do quite a bit of compost, but when I stopped doing compost, I would just do that earlier. So I would prepare, instead of 3 weeks in advance, I might try and do that 2 months in advance, and then let the microbial community work it. And I would probably cover it with some kind of tarp.
Oh, okay.
On a small scale, I am a believer of plastic tarps.
Okay.
I think that's where reusable plastic tarps make total sense, or reusable clear plastic to warm up the soil in the spring, for example. That's where it makes a lot of sense, because you have the small space and you can reuse it.
Especially for places that get snow and they're kind of closing their garden down for winter. That makes a lot of sense too, right?
Right. If you need to turn your beds over faster, you can still do that, actually. But use the plastic mulch to speed things up. Excuse me, it is plastic mulch, but you know what I mean, a plastic tarp, to speed things up much more quickly. You can turn beds over pretty quickly by doing just what you're talking about, and cutting things back, leaving the roots, and then you'll have to push the residue aside a little bit to plant into it.
Right.
Which I'm sure you know and already do.
I've been doing that with my tomatoes specifically, not seeded crops. That bed has to be clean, but because the seeds just get devoured by whatever critters are crawling around in there. But certainly big established, seedlings that you can put in. I'm thinking of Ruth Stout and her no-till gardening. You've basically taken that whole process of taking biomass and composting it somewhere else, and then spreading it onto the garden or farm rows out of the equation. You're doing it all in place so that it happens. It's less work.
A lot less work.
It's less work.
Why I was able to maintain the farm in Eastern Oregon by myself for 2 years, because it really is less work.
Yeah. So I want to ask, for the sake of most of the people in our audience are probably small space gardeners who are growing in either raised beds or in containers or, very small gardens. And so they don't necessarily have row feet that they can plant the rows between their crop rows that they can plant with these, perennial nitrogen or high carbon crops. So how do you recommend adapting, or do you have any recommendations for adapting this method to home garden size?
I think that you want to think about annual plants to add diversity to your garden space and have growing roots. You want to have something in there growing in between when you have crops growing, right? And so during the time that your crops are in the ground, maybe you want to have a mix of something pretty that adds sequential bloom with pollen and nectar for all your beneficials, but then it's also something that you can mow and leave in place. So maybe you have an annual crimson clover, for example, or an annual berseem clover. The crimson clover has those beautiful red flowers, and having some of that in on the edge of your bed, running down your bed, and then you can mow it and put it where you take out your lettuce, for example, and then that can go there. You can cover it with a tarp, and then your fall crop could go in there. Your fall broccoli or your fall kale, hopefully as transplants, would go. But the other thing that I really recommend, if you have any space where you can get away with this, you could even do it in a container, is to have one extra container or one extra bed that gets rotated every year, or for part of the year if you have a 3-season garden. And that gets to be an annual mix of just what you were talking about: peas and clovers and some annual grasses, things that will decompose very quickly, that you can then put aside that bed, and that becomes part of your rotation.
Yeah, I do have, or at least for a time, it sort of stopped growing. I don't know why, but I had one 2x4 bed that was a perennial alfalfa that I would just keep cutting down and adding. I actually feed it to the chickens a lot, but it would also be my high nitrogen ingredient for my compost bin. But now I'm thinking, in my mind, like, maybe if I just take all of my mulched pathways and turn it into perennial
living
mulches, cover crops, that I can just, tamp down or cut down every once in a while. I'm like, that's kind of unused space. It's where I kneel down and work in the garden, but wouldn't that work?
Absolutely. And one of my friends did just that in the pathways in his garden. He grew the annual, very drought tolerant grass, teff, TEFF.
Teff, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Teff. And teff is obviously a higher carbon, lower nitrogen material, but it's a perfect pathway. And as long as when you add that as a residue, you also add a nitrogen residue as well, a legume or something green and succulent. Even the teff green and succulent could work. That would be a lovely way to have a drought tolerant pathway that you could add to your add as your fertilizer or your mulch.
Okay. Now I have to ask specifically about clover, because I'm so hesitant to recommend it as a crop to grow in raised beds, because it's so invasive here. Once it takes hold, it's really hard to get rid of. And I don't want, I've had people grow it and be like, I can't get my bed back. So how do you manage growing clover in a growing space?
Well, I do need to tell you that where I have evolved with my system is, remember, I do have things growing. I do have the living mulch growing back into my beds, and I am learning to manage that ecological relationship and say, aha, this is my cover crop. I don't have to seed.
Okay.
But the way I would manage that is I would only use annual clovers. In a small space, I just wouldn't use the white clovers, and God forbid, never use red clover. And I have a whole section on annual clovers and annual living mulch as cover crops, because I think for small spaces, it really is vital. I think things can get out of control very easily.
It's true. I've had too many kind of rookie gardeners who are like, clover, it's nitrogen fixing, let's grow it. And then they're like, why can't I grow anything in this bed? It's all clover now. So yeah, I like the idea of having annual crops only in there. I just want to throw out the term. I've heard people use the term chop and drop. And that's sort of what you're doing, right? It's the same idea. You're cutting down above ground stuff, leaving it there, and you don't have to worry about moving it to a compost pile to create a bin, a compost pile, and then, move the finished compost back to the garden. Yay.
I used to spend so much time doing that.
Yeah. I right now have a pile of biomass outside, trimmings from the garden that I have to shred and make a compost pile with. And I'm just like, I don't have it in me anymore. I don't know what to do. So I'm really thinking a lot about your process here and how to incorporate it. So I have a really completely nerdy question, because in your book, you share your research on carbon levels and carbon to nitrogen levels in your soils over the year. Regular folks know how to do nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and soil pH tests with home kits. Some of us have, including myself, have microscopes where we can survey soil biology under a microscope just to check like the levels are good and maybe there's fungi in the soil. And some people, professionals have refractometers for specific measurements, but how do you measure microbially active carbon in soils?
Yes, I do need to tell you that both my husband and I used a standard soil test lab for 40 years, and we began to think that with this new system that we developed, that we needed a different way of testing the soil. And I still do both, because you just can't break 40 years of a habit. But we started going to a different soil test, and that's where the microbially active carbon came in, and where we would get where we did our microbial ecology work too, where we tested for total microbial biomass. Mm-hmm. And that was called, well, the test is called the Haney test, and we went to Ward Labs, and I'm having a mental block on where Ward Labs is now.
Yeah, and you mentioned it in the book, and I can't remember. Oh well, I'll post it in the show notes when I look it up.
Yes, but Ward Labs, I think there are other labs doing this. I don't have them at the top of my brain cells at the moment, but Ward Lab did not only the soluble nutrients that you find in the soil, the nitrate nitrogen, the phosphate phosphorus. It did this microbially active carbon and organic nitrogen and organic phosphorus. And those are the nutrients that the microbial community are working on and then making available into the soil for our plants. And I think that's where the soil revolution is, for me, is learning how to work with those nutrients as the more quicker release nutrients. Because in graduate school and college, I learned to handle and to work with those quick release nutrients. Right. But now I know that plants in natural or native communities utilize these other levels of nutrients, the organic nutrients, that go through the whole microbial community and then are available, and that I can mimic that.
It's fascinating. And I want everyone to get this book and read it. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. And I know that it gets easier after the part that I've read, or so far, the part that I'm in right now. It's a little dense in the beginning, but then we get to the more, plant profiles and things like that. So the ecological gardener, it's a wonderful thing.
The ecological
Oh,
farm.
farm. Sorry, I keep saying that wrong. The ecological farm. I think because I want a farm, but I only have a garden. That's where my brain is.
And I wanted to tell you that I know the first part of the book is dense. The second part of the book goes crop by crop and gives more just straight practical details and troubleshooting and lots of pictures everywhere. I think that you might forgive me for the density in the early part because of all the pictures.
I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. Come for the science, stay for the knowledge. It is tip time. Do you have a favorite tip you'd like to share with the Garden Nerd audience?
Yes. Okay. We've talked so much about soils. I'm going to give a biological control or a creating habitat for our beneficial insects tip.
Okay.
Because what we really want to do is have habitat blooming year round if we can, or certainly for as long as we can. We want season long sequential bloom. So we want a diversity. But some plants have better pollen and nectar and encourage more beneficials. And so I've done quite a bit of research on that. And by accident, I found my favorite plant.
Tell me.
So my favorite beneficial insect plant is parsnips allowed to flower. You just let your parsnips go to flower. And I sent you a picture of that.
And it's covered in beneficial insects, like multiple types.
Covered. I had a friend come up last summer who works for Atra, and he was so excited. He was out taking pictures of all kinds of beneficial insects. So they have this wonderful pollen and nectar, and they get tall with these big yellow umbel flowers. And if you can find space for them in your garden, and of course you get to have some of the roots too, just let every fifth one go to flower, but in a small space, do not let them go to seed. No. Because they will become a weed.
Yeah. Well, I grow parsnips every year, but it never occurred to me, because I'm always harvesting all of the roots. It never occurred to me to let some of them go. What makes them better than, say, other umbels like cilantro or parsley or celery? Is it the pollen and nectar, or is it something else?
I think it is the type of pollen and nectar, because all of those umbels are particularly good for parasitic wasps because they have the nice small flower shape, and they can get to them safely and easily. But I've had all of those flowers growing next to parsnips, and still the parsnips are the ones that are preferred. So I actually don't have a great answer for that, but we do know that just like there's carbon and nitrogen quality, or at least carbon to nitrogen ratio quality in residue, there's pollen and nectar quality in plants that make them more interesting and a better food source for different beneficial insects. And that's a whole study in and of itself.
It is. Well, thank you so much, Helen, for sharing that expert tip and all of the knowledge that you've shared today on the Garden Nerd Tip of the Week podcast. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm not very good at social media. I'm sorry to say I'm one of those old Luddites, but my husband and I develop a YouTube site where we put up videos of our research, some of the projects that we had done, and that is Agrarian Dreams at YouTube, Agrarian Dreams. I have a website that I have not attended well. Fortunately, I tend my gardens better than my websites. The website is veganicpermaculture.com. And then my husband had maintained our website, woodleyfarm.org.
Okay, woodleyfarm.org. Well, thank you so much. All right, garden nerds, you will find links to Woodleaf Farm and where to buy Helen's book this week at Gardenerd.com. We'll also share Helen's YouTube channel and her website on veganic permaculture. That's it for this week. Subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. Visit us for tons of free gardening information at Gardenerd.com. Special thanks to True Leaf Market for sponsoring this episode as well. You'll find us on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter under GardenNerd1, on Facebook as GardenNerd.com, and of course, our Garden Nerd YouTube channel. Happy gardening.